The discrepancy, there are a number of discrepancies in the data which TPR has published and PPF has published relative to the surveys being produced by the Office for National Statistics. If we look at the December 2023 date, which is the last date for which I have TPR asset values, they show asset values of 1.518 trillion, and PPF seems to think that at that date, schemes had assets of 1.428 trillion. Now, that difference in itself is surprising because you expect PPF asset values to be higher than TPR values. TPR values would be the values we report in company accounts and generally. PPF values will be higher because of the presence of buy-in insurance policies within the PPF universe. Those policies are worth more to the PPF by virtue of the fact that the policies pay the full benefits of the underlying members, whereas the PPF, of course, only pays its reduced benefits. Now, the thing which is really staggering is the difference now between the ONS numbers and TPR's numbers are, frankly, astronomical. £327 billion of difference in the assets that TPR reckons schemes have, and the ONS survey results. Now, that's around 30% of the assets of schemes according to PPF or according to ONS. I'll ask everyone on the call immediately. The decline in assets according to TPR over that period from December 21, which was really pre-crisis, and the crisis, of course, occurred much earlier than just the 22 September Truss Kwarteng mess. But TPR thinks that assets declined by just 15.2% over that period. And I'd ask people just to look at their own schemes and consider how much the assets that they hold have declined over that period. The other thing which is surprising in here is that the difference between ONS numbers and TPR numbers is continuing to increase. Basically, the LDI crisis, if you like, was all over by March of 23, June of 23 at the latest. And yet we have TPR differences with ONS continuing to increase. In fact, half of the increase in difference has occurred over the 2023 year, not over the 2022 year, which is where most of the attention has been focused. And of course, the Bank of England's work on LDI has been focused on gilts, which is in itself inadequate because more non-gilt securities were sold and more non-gilts were moved around in rebalancing than gilts. But there's a real problem here. One would expect if, for example, TPR had simply missed, say, 200 million of losses in 2022, then you would expect that to compound a little due to investment effects over the coming year, over the 23 year. If you say 10% return on assets, that's going to give you 20 billion of rise. but the rise is much more than can be explained by those sort of effects. So that's the basic set of problems. Work and Pensions Committee are aware of these differences, obviously not the latest ones, and they have asked for an explanation, which we have not yet seen. Now, the question is, should we trust the ONS survey? Well, this is what goes into the ONS survey. This is how they sample it. Sample is a total of 614 schemes. They change them not quite at random because they sample all 30 schemes greater than 50,000 members, all schemes in the 10 to 50,000 range, and in the 2 to 10,000 range, they sample 142 out of 453. So that's a 31% sample rate. And then there's 4,000 small schemes, 4,500, 4,600 schemes, which are less than 2,000 members. And that's about 6% of their sample. So the overall sample that they're taking is around 12% of the number of schemes in their sample. Note you've got 5,262 schemes in here because in the ONS counting, they also include schemes in liquidation. So ONS numbers should, by virtue of the fact that they contain schemes in liquidation, be higher than TPR numbers. Now, the important thing is that by the volume of assets, that sample of 614 schemes is some 70 to 75% of the overall value of assets. Now, let's go back and touch on that problem earlier. We have a 30% difference between the TPR numbers and the ONS numbers, and we really can't expect that 30% difference to be explained by a difference which is 25 to 30% of the overall value of assets. It just doesn't make sense. Now, we did a simulation. We collected over 1,000 published scheme results. Not all were published, some we simply called and asked for. Some we were supplied by consultants and people like the Pensions Trust. It's all anonymous, or it was all anonymous. And we fitted distributions to those data points that we had collected and then conducted a simulation. And what we're simulating is the collection of 80 to 90% response rates on random samples of 614 from our 1,100 sets of results. So the result we get is that the simulation says that we have in March 22, 1,213 million of assets in that 614 sample, and in March 23, 918 billion. That's a decline of 24.3%. For comparison, the ONS overall number showed a decline of, this is overall, so it's not comparable directly to the simulation, showed a decline of 27%. PPF showed a decline of 13.7%, and TPR a decline of 13.9% over that year. Now, the question we then asked was, that's fine, well, if our simulation is 1,200 and PPF reckons the number is 1,669, what do we need to make in the balance of the set of schemes which were not sampled, the 4,600? The answer is that for ONS we need 493 billion, PPF 456, and TPR 431. We do the same thing again then for March 2023, and we get the numbers shown below: 326 billion, 522, and 497. That says that our simulation is suggesting that small schemes did worse than the large schemes and schemes overall, and lost 33.9% in their asset values. That's relative to the numbers published. To get to the PPF number, you need a gain in asset values over the year 2022-2023, which just seems completely unreasonable. In fact, it requires a gain of 14.5%. And the number for TPR is 15.3%. Which do we think makes more sense, ONS or those other figures? Well, our answer to that is ONS. Any questions on that? I can't see if anyone is raising hands, so we should.
There's quite a few comments in the chat, Con.
Yeah.
They're kind of agreeing with you and sort of discussing how the surveys sort of worked and what the composition is of each survey. Bob Compton's asked whether the ONS survey does the same schemes each time in the less than 10,000 group.
No, it doesn't. They periodically rebalance the survey, the sample, the actual entities claimed, the entities surveyed. They also allow differently for different response rates. Of the 614 approached, the response rate is usually between, well, it has always been between 80 and 90%. And some of them come in late, which is one of the reasons you see revisions from ONS in subsequent publications of the data set. Now, I just want to touch on a related topic. Is there anything else on those first couple of slides?
I think Bobby's comment is interesting, that if you're running as you're involved in the smaller schemes, by which I guess you mean less than $500 million or something, you don't get to see much of the ONS. Bobby, are you actually on the call? Do you want to illustrate that?
Yeah, I'm on the call. Yeah. So I advised over 100 schemes, and we only ever got asked to fill in the survey for 4 schemes. And the schemes that we got asked to fill in the survey for, we got told we'd have to fill it in every future quarter going forward.
I think they've varied the rigor of that stuff in recent times. But the area where it is weakest, obviously, is smaller schemes. But the amount of money involved with the smaller schemes is that much smaller. Their sampling technique is pretty sound. Now,
Peter's got his hand raised, Con, and then there's a question from Barry as well.
Go ahead.
If we go to Peter first.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we're in the smaller scheme category. We were asked to complete the survey and for future quarters, and then after about 18 months, they said, "Thank you, you no longer have to complete the survey." So they sort of cycle through the smaller schemes, I think.
They do indeed. They try to keep the burden on smaller schemes down.
Barry, did you want to ask your question?
Thanks. Yeah. Con, you think the ONS numbers are the ones that are right, but I was wondering whether the ONS numbers would be excluding some assets, for example, insurance policies,
No,
or even if they are, whether that would be enough to bridge the gap.
no. Well, the answer is no. Insurance policies are explicitly included, and there's 145 billion of them held by schemes according to the ONS sample, according to the ONS published results. The ONS won't capture schemes which have bought out, but yeah, they do capture buy-in policies. Yeah, and we'll touch on that a little later.
Thank you.
Now, let's go to the next slide.
Bobby's just got his hand raised again. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's related to.
Right.
Yeah, so the schemes that I looked after, the insurance policies was pooled funds like the LGIM Index Tracker Fund. That was what the insurance policies were. It didn't ask for the historically purchased annuities, not buy in big transactions, but historically purchased annuities were not asked for in the assets. So they are so some insurance policies are excluded.
Well, in fact, I was speaking with the ONS about this literally last week, and they tell me that the overwhelming majority of the insurance policies, of which there are now 145 billion, are in fact buy-in policies. There are one or two which are buy-in policies with attached longevity swaps on them, the purpose of which I've not managed to work out in my own mind, but there we are.
Yeah, well, I've gone through the spreadsheet quite detailed a few times, and it doesn't actually have anywhere in there for historically purchased annuities. So that might only be a small number, but those historically purchased annuities are not included. I don't think the consultants are putting them into the survey.
Yeah, but they may be including them under insurance policies. I don't know. I haven't had sight of the responses to the ONS, and nor will I ever have come to that. But the majority, the important insurance policies here are the buy-in policies and what's been going on there. I will come on to talk about some aspects of that later. Now we've just seen, if I can go to the next slide, unless there are any more questions. Right, let's go to the next slide. The DB funding analysis, which has just been produced. The funding analysis makes much of the fact that schemes in tranche 17, which of course is about a third of overall schemes, had improved from around 92 to around 97. The point I would make is that is surprisingly different from what we have seen elsewhere. The point really that I would make is the following. First of all, if we look at TPs versus section 179 in that data set, that shows section 179 valuations coming in 13.8% below TPs. Now, that makes a nonsense of a submission that the PPF made to Work and Pensions Committee, where they were talking about the cost of increasing benefits to scheme members, of increasing benefits so that, for example, the 10% wouldn't get paid out or whatever, where they showed some increases in costs, which were as much as 40% or so. But if we look at the values of buyout, now we don't know exactly when the valuations in that set are, because the 1,700 schemes are sometimes, the valuation is somewhere within the year. But they show buyout as 121% of technical provisions whenever that occurs. And of course, it doesn't necessarily have to occur simultaneously with the technical provision value. But that compares with March 22 buyout values of 133% estimated by TPR elsewhere, and 123% at the end of September, which is a little different. And then,
Con, just confirming that, Connor, there was just a question in the chat, but those percentages are percentage of technical provisions basis, aren't they? So Section 179 was 86. The liabilities were 86% of the technical provision basis. Yeah.
Technical Section 179 is 86.2% of technical provisions, and buyout is 121% according to the published figures there.
Thank you.
Now, if you look at TPR and the published values in the course of the year, that's the figure on the left-hand side. They showed 103%. This is funding to technical provision levels. They show funding at 103.3% in December of 2023. And that's 52% of schemes versus the 97 at TPR and 47%. Then in March, they show 104.1, 57% of schemes. June, 105.3, 59%. September, well, that's end September, so that number's probably questionable. But the number being reported in terms of funding here is significantly less than TPR's earlier estimates, and the estimates on which all of the impact assessment which justified low dependency portfolios was done. If ONS is right, then there's a real problem there. 150, 200 billion of additional funding needed by schemes to meet the low dependency targets, and not the 20 million of the impact assessment. Now, LDI, where are we? What's likely to be the situation going forward? So we'll consider proportion of assets held relative to the overall value of scheme assets. That will obviate any numerical value differences. So we start with pooled funds and repo, and we see very little change at all. Pooled funds started the period before any of the crisis with 12.7% of their assets being equity in pooled funds, and in the end of this, it's 12.4% of scheme assets. These are ONS assets, which are employed in equity of pooled funds, pooled LDI funds. Repo also has changed hardly at all, 10.7% to 10%. Now, of course, there's been a significant shift, according to the press and the public relations of the LDI fund managers, and that leverage within pooled LDI funds has fallen anecdotally from about 3.5 to 2.5 times. So there is probably a decline in coverage, which we'll come to in a moment. Similarly, the use of debt securities, including index-linked gilts, has hardly changed at all. This is the overall debt security exposure, 45% at the beginning, 45% at the end. Gilts being 33% at the beginning, 34% at the end. Linkers in that gilt category, 21%, down to 20.6%. So not very much change at all, really, which is perhaps surprising. But the duration of gilts held has changed remarkably. This figure is long gilts as a proportion of all gilts. And they have gone down from 61% of the gilts held to 48.1. That's actually a material shift. Now, you would expect some shift due to duration shifts. If the duration of schemes has shifted down by about 3 years, which is probably reasonable, if maybe a little high, but that would actually account for less than half of the gilt shift that we see. Now, we can then consider the adequacy of those hedging instruments overall by considering funding ratios, okay? This is the funding sufficiency of schemes. These are using pension regulators' estimates of liabilities and ONS's reported assets. ONS does not publish any liability figures, and they've never managed to convince themselves of a sound way of collecting liability numbers, which is why it's proved to be an ongoing saga. Now, for schemes to be fully hedged, given those numbers, the gearing within pooled LDI funds would have needed to have been this. To be fully hedged, they would have needed to be 2.94 times leveraged, or geared rather, back in 2021, and that would have risen to 3.32 now. That is a bit surprising. If we ask the question, if LDI funds, pooled funds, are in fact just 2.5 times levered, how much hedging is there out there? And the answer to that would be 69.3% of scheme liabilities would be hedged. That's surprisingly low, but schemes have brought in significant portions of liabilities, and these are the insurance policy liabilities held by schemes, the number we were discussing earlier. This has, as is only reasonable, risen from 8.4% to 11.9% of scheme assets, though the actual value of those policies has held pretty much constant. That leads to the conclusion that overall, the market overall is around 80.4% hedged. Now, the greatest surprise in here is the part that we haven't mentioned, which is interest rate swaps. Interest rate swaps are really rather disappointing. We look at the change in liability values and the change in interest rate swaps, and while the correlation is strong, 0.91, the magnitude of movements is extremely low. Interest rate swaps aren't contributing materially to the hedging of LDI, of DB schemes in any meaningful way. The swaps went down by 23%, by 23 billion, when liabilities went down by 542. Our conclusion, looking at all of this, is that schemes were underhedged and exposed to a material risk of funding ratio decline as gilt yields fall, given the decline in duration of gilt holdings and the lower leverage within pooled LDI funds. I think that we could be in for a sticky time. So that's numbers. Let's go to some other stuff. Complete change of topic. Are there any questions on the LDI or any of the other areas that we've spoken about?
I had one comment, Con, just on the sort of smaller schemes, kind of the experiences that we've had with some of the smaller schemes, and you mentioned the ONS had them going down a lot, and the PPF and the regulator had them going up a lot in terms of the assets. I mean, we've seen for some of our smaller schemes that if they hadn't been quite so well hedged, with everything getting cheaper, some of the sponsors were willing to pop quite a lot more money in to kind of fill the gap and sort of get to the buy-in stage sort of more immediately and stop the ongoing expenses of running the smaller schemes. I didn't know if that might have had an effect on some of the numbers that might be being seen.
It's captured in the ONS numbers in contributions. The contributions to DB schemes, deficit repair contributions and other contributions other than regular contributions have not gone down as much as we might have expected. And that could very well be the reason. I've no way of estimating what the overall magnitude of those sort of effects would be or would have been. But the value of contributions made is captured by the ONS surveys.
Cool. And thank you for that. And there was one question from David Robbins. I don't know if you want to ask your question, David, or we can ask it for you.
Yeah, I can do. Sorry if you covered this earlier, because I've missed parts of the discussion, but the ONS says that response rates for the last couple of quarters are 84% and 78%. So yeah, not bad response rates, but I guess whether there's any scope for error there depends on whether it's small schemes or large schemes who aren't responding. I don't suppose you know anything about that.
Yeah, I've asked the same question of them, David, several times. It tends to be the smaller schemes that miss. You can actually get an estimate of misses from the revisions to numbers that the ONS publishes, and they are all quite small. Looking at the last three sets of revisions, the revisions to the last three quarters, they've been 5 billion, 8 billion, 12 billion, small numbers. When we're looking for a missing 300, these numbers are not material. And 5 billion in a trillion too really is noise rather than substance. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
In the simulation that we did, we didn't actually. Our simulation was based on response rates randomly chosen between 80 and 90. We didn't have a response rate as low as 78 in that simulation. It would have. What would it have done? It would have lowered our numbers by about 2 to 3 billion. Not big, but yeah, simulation's a simulation. It was just, which are the more reasonable? ONS comes up looking more reasonable. Any further questions?
Got a couple more, Con. Oh, sorry, David.
Well, sorry, I was going to make a very quick point while I've got the microphone, which is just for, Con mentioned impact assessments for funding regime and so on. Yeah, but I think the other point here is the assessment of whether there's a market failure of a buyout market that needs PPF to step in as a consolidator partly depends on whether you think there are loads of small schemes who are fully funded on a buyout basis who can't get a quote, and that conclusion looks a lot more plausible under the PPF TPR numbers than it does under the ONS numbers.
Yeah, we have published earlier ONS numbers, which so ONS buyout numbers. One of the problems that we have is that the PPF's purple book, not the most recent one, but the one before, had an absolutely outrageous increase in the price of buyout, to which actually leads me to think it was just plain wrong. But the new purple book should actually put us in a position to see where that is. But I have worked out and have published elsewhere numbers for buyout and so on. I can't look them up at the moment because this is my daughter's laptop, not mine. But I'll be happy to dig them out and send them to you.
Con, we've got 3 questions and we've also got 20 minutes left, so I'll just
Right.
just pop through. So Peter's got his hand up first.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, oh, sorry, right, I couldn't get out of mute. Yeah, and just an observation, I cannot for the life of me think that fundamentally why do we have to think about pension schemes liabilities in terms of gilts? There's no significance to a pension scheme to gilts except it's a possible investment which generates a reasonable return. Perhaps.
I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, if you really want to present value your liabilities, I think the appropriate measure is the return on the assets that you are holding, ultimately to pay those liabilities. Now, if you're operating an unfunded scheme and you're a corporation, that discount rate would be your profitability rate, your own rate of return on capital. Yeah,
thank you. Yes,
but yeah, we totally agree over
I'm glad
that.
I'm not alone in my.
No. The use of gilt-based discount rates is complete nonsense. Yeah, it's a misunderstanding of modern finance theory. Any more questions?
And Bob?
Right, okay, Con. Very, very interesting and rehashes stuff you've presented before, but TPR have tried to defend their calculation basis by saying they're looking at valuations going back over 3 years and they do put in assumptions as to how they bring it forward. Have you done an assessment of how TPR actually go about calculating their numbers? Can you actually find flaws in the process?
No, when I've asked them for the detail of process, it's not been forthcoming.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't. I mean, if I could guess at what they're doing, but then if I then publish anything which is based on a guess of what they're doing, they're just going to come back and say, "Well, it's not what we're doing."
Yeah.
But they don't publish how they arrive at their numbers. They have only recently published numbers in other publications, publications to the Work and Pensions Committee and so on. That's where the values come from. That's where the discrepancy becomes evident.
Okay.
But it's the important thing is it's the TPR numbers which have fed into policy, and I think they have been incredibly counterproductive.
Is the DWP fully aware? Sorry, the Work and Pensions Committee and the DWP, are they fully aware that actually the numbers that TPR are using could be smoke and mirrors, either figments of the imagination?
Back at the beginning of the year, Work and Pensions Committee, in their report in March, I think it was, or maybe April, asked DWP and TPR and ONS and PPF to sort out where these differences were arising. We haven't seen anything back from TPR. The nearest we get to an admission by TPR that something may be wrong is a rather cryptic reference by Neil Bull to schemes, DB schemes having assets of 1.3 trillion, when none of TPR's figures published so far have been as low as that. Yeah, I mean, it's 200 billion below the December figure that they publish if it's 1.3.
Con, do you think that Nautical Dalpress is aware of this
Well,
problem?
I think that one of the things I have suggested, we don't know the new makeup of Work and Pensions Committee. We only know that Debbie Abrahams will be leading it. I have dropped Debbie Abrahams an email suggesting that one of their first jobs might be to prod TPR to actually come up with a response on this stuff. Yeah. And beyond an acknowledgement, I've had nothing further. But I don't think we'll hear anything further until all of the membership of Work and Pensions Committee is formed. Okay.
We have one last question.
Yeah.
From so one last hand raised. Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Yeah. The last little conversation was sort of moving towards what I was wondering, just so that Con can say more clearly, I think. Given those vast differences, why should we care? And why should politicians care?
And the principal reason that everyone should care is that it's leading to a misallocation of assets. What you're seeing is assets are being bought. The required rate of return on the assets held by schemes, that's the target you need to achieve. And if you are working with an asset value which is 30% higher than reality, you're going to be chasing a lower investment return and probably buying gilts instead of buying equities. It will have effects all over the place. Yeah. Right. Let's plow into this.
Can I just to add to Con's comments? I mean, the John Kay paper, December 23, is kind of fundamental on this. This is the biggest policy disaster in British economic history. If you've got a 300 billion gap that we don't know about, but we're actually aiming to fund it through contributions, you're going to suck immense amounts of capital out of corporations filling the gap. And we're also fantastically disinvesting our own economies to buy gilts. This is a policy disaster which is unfathomable scale, but it's just inconvenient to discuss it from a governmental perspective. So I mean, Con's work is absolutely fundamental and critical, and this needs to be aired. But the consequences are enormous for our economy, absolutely enormous.
I've got news for you.
In my opinion, sorry.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, John. I've got news for you. If you were to call for 300 billion from the corporate sector, they don't have it.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I mean, that's after 250 billion in the last 20 years, which is another enormous misallocation of capital. We actually run out of money as an economy. That's the importance of it. We're not. I mean, I said today, I was quoting a number of 50 billion. Yeah. 50 billion is 50,000 millions. It's just enormous amounts of money we're missing here.
Right. Let me get on with the rest of this presentation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about taxes and productive investment. The Chancellor has adopted the two rules, which are basically the same as Hunt had. And I'm just going to flip through these because I guess what can be said here, you can read the slides in your own leisure. The question is, what's she going to do to give herself some headroom And there are a number of things which come immediately to mind. The first of which seems to have received no press coverage, is that the B of E's announcement of 100 billion of QT in the coming year was 10 billion less than the OBR's forecast, and actually 25 billion less than my own forecast, which is a windfall gain for Reeves. That gives her 10 billion of headroom. But probably the simplest thing to do is change the target from public sector net debt to public sector net financial liabilities. You can see that's 100 billion of difference there. The current measure, by the way, is public sector net debt less Bank of England liabilities. Public sector net debt is rising and is unlikely to fall over the coming 5 years. Public sector net debt ex BOV depends very much on what the Bank of England does on the QT program. There is an argument for moving to public sector net liabilities, which is public sector net debt basically is an incentive to sell off your illiquid assets like the student loan book or whatever, regardless of the price you get for it. That's not a very good idea. The problem with public sector net debt is you can game the thing by classifying things as loans rather than otherwise. I'm just going to skip through this page because basically we've seen 6 changes to such targets in the last 9 years. So there'll be nothing new associated with this being done by Rachel Reeves. The point is, excluding public investment companies is absolutely standard practice in Europe. KfW, Vattenfall, there are lots and lots of others. Excluding those entities from the numbers being measured, it's basically entities which are involved in market production, which are excluded from those numbers. Now, that suggests a second approach is more appropriate, which is more like KfW and Vattenfall, which is development corporations. These would actually borrow themselves in public markets. The concept is described very fully with illustrations to using the proposed Cambridge to Oxford rail link in a paper published by Cambridge University's Bennett Institute. It's written by Tom Aubrey, who is a credit analyst at Hart. Basically, it's central to the improvement of governments is you want the entity doing the delivery also responsible for the financing. That you can do through development corporations. You need to do them at scale, and it's scale which is bigger than can typically be undertaken by a typical local authority. That's the nearest you'll get with existing arrangements, and maybe mayoral combined authorities. That really has been very widely used in Europe. It's been used in Paris. It's been used in Gothenburg, all over the place. The point about such a set of entities borrowing, development corporations borrowing, is it would give us an adjunct to the gilt market, very much like the US agency market. These things can probably borrow at 50 to 100 basis points over gilts in their own right, and offer us greater depth to our capital markets. I'd suggest reading the overall paper from the Bennett Institute. Now, the idea of creating on such a level was foreshadowed in the 2023 Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. That makes a very important amendment to the 1961 Land Compensation Act. Basically, it means you no longer have to pay the people you are buying land for your projects the hope value of that land, which is the redevelopment value, the value which becomes immediate when you grant planning permission. Then, in the case of the Cambridge to Oxford project, the rail line linking that, that simple hope value actually generates 10 or 11 billion pounds towards the project financing. So of the order of 40% of its financing. The land value capture could be a very important part of the financing arrangements of development corporations. I'd like to see them exist. Basically, the type of investment you're talking about has a whole series of problems. PFI basically won't do it, or it won't do it at a cost that we can really afford. Central government is a real problem because the people budgeting and the people delivering and the people financing are all different and all have different motives. Local authorities are just too bloody small. So we should seriously think about using development corporations. New taxes. There's
just been a question from John about what when you say at scale, what sort of scale do you mean for the development corporations?
I think you're talking about projects which are £10 billion plus. But that could be major new housing projects. It could be bridges, it could be roads. There are all sorts of areas where it could be. Small scale, local authorities have no problem. But once you get a project that becomes bigger than 500 or 600 million, to most councillors, those numbers are just meaningless. The scale, 10 billion plus projects.
Thank you.
Perhaps
you.
smaller. That's something that one could certainly work on with the new sovereign wealth funds and the National Energy Fund and so on. And they, by the way, could very well be excluded from definitions of national debt. Rachel Reeves really has no problem creating headroom to do whatever lending she wants to do without breaching the existing arrangements. Now, the final thing I want to touch on is a windfall tax on bulk annuity insurers. This would raise about 3 billion. If you think about it, we saw 145 billion of buy-in held by DB schemes, probably another 50 billion or so of buyout. It's made the buy-in business, the bulk annuity insurance business, now accounts for almost half of the profitability of the UK life insurers. And it's a crazy arrangement. The tax that is being proposed, William McGrath has done a lot of numbers on this, and is one of the leading proponents of introducing a windfall tax. But so also is the Tony Blair Institute. Basically, the operation of moving a set of DB pension liabilities to an insurer is economically sterile. It's just, there's no uplift to pensioners, and actually lowers the holding of gilts and productive capital, which of course competes with the Chancellor's objectives. The Tony Blair Institute puts in a further recommendation, which is the elimination of tax deductibility in respect of the supplementary premium. That is to say, the premium paid by the seller, the company, over and above the value of its liabilities, calculated in the standard way. Don't expect the insurance companies to like this idea. The rationale is there's a regulatory arbitrage there. TPR is calculating DB scheme liabilities under low dependency as gilts plus 50. PRA is easing solvency requirements, so liabilities are calculated at gilts plus 150. That is a great way for the insurers to make a great deal of money very quickly. And of course, there's supply is limited because these have to be insurance companies. They're limited by regulation. And of course, some of the consultants are still extremely enthusiastic about buyout. It's quite simply clawback of the tax benefit received on corporates. Why should you be given a tax benefit, or why should the tax benefit you have been given be kept by the person to whom these things are transferred, when that tax benefit is when the cost to you is that much lower? And of course, run-on is likely to be greatly helped by TAS 300 and IFRS 17. Those are some interesting ideas. I don't know, is William McGrath on the call?
Yeah.
William, do you want to say anything on windfall? You're the man who's done more on this than anybody.
No, I just think there is a very interesting regulatory arbitrage which has developed, and maybe just looking at the sums when you do your TAS 300 exercise emphasizes just how much money has been made. And I think it's a perfectly legitimate way of the government maybe looking at the revenue that could be generated from this phase in which there's been an explosion in the buyout market over the last 5 years, and probably to a level that wasn't expected. So I think those are all perfectly logical points you put up there, and let's see if it gets picked up. I just think that once you start doing the sums properly and factor in all the things you've been talking about this morning, what is the real numbers? Let's get back to a lot of real numbers, and you look at the benefit to members of going to the FSCS cover rather than the PPF cover. Is it really worth it? Or if you run the scheme on, and this is really trying to level the playing field between the life insurers and the other ideas of credible alternatives, once you've done that, then I think the numbers will out, and a good phase of good quality numbers being looked at by all the parties will result in new thinking coming along. And I think, why not now? The government emphasizing that it is changing its tack, by emphasizing to corporates they should run on, and emphasize, yeah, it has been a remarkably good phase for the life insurers. But as John was pointing out, giving them another 50 billion a year is creating a new concentration risk, which to me means the whole FSCS as the gold standard is going to need to be rethought. It's a very different business than when it was knocking out a few billion a year. So yeah, I think a corrective to what's happened, creating a level playing field, everybody's going to be looking at a much healthier overall market.
Thank you, William.
Todd, can I just comment on the technicalities of that tax capture? I mean, the benefit's not necessarily to the corporate or the scheme. I mean, of the scheme 1.5 billion of assets, that's not changed in the last 4 years, but the liability numbers come down by $1 billion. So there's been no gain there, other than you're now within buyout pricing. So there's not actually a gain to the scheme or the sponsor, just the liability measurement has changed. The real beneficiary of this transfer of value is the insurer. So surely the tax should be levied on the insurer premium.
Oh no, absolutely. The tax is levied on the insurer.
Yeah,
this is a windfall tax. That where are they getting the gain, as Con was pointing out, is basically it's all being tax deducted on the way in. Do you want more of that? I'm not sure you do. This is a straightforward tax gain made by the insurance industry. And you've only got to look, as Con said, we looked at a lot of the numbers. You've got to look at the new accounting, CSM, the contractual service margins, what they've got, which is effectively the profits they've made over time. Look at the solvency of some of the Rothschilds of this world, and you can see that's where the cash is. And if you're looking for new sources of maybe a one-off amount of cash, a jolly good place to look. It's your regulations have made it possible for that money to end up there. Well, okay, perhaps we should reflect on why it's happened and look at it as a potential income source. So yeah, this is a small group of life insurers have done extremely well, exceptionally well because of those factors. It's time for the government to have a look and see, well, maybe that wasn't the intention in the first place. You've done particularly well. There is a gap between the DWP and the PRA's thinking. They're going in different directions. As that comes together, okay, there's been a strange period of this last 5 years. And yeah, we want to have a windfall tax, and maybe, and I think this is a good idea as well to think about is, yeah, why is the FSCS free for the life insurance or packaged in, and the PPF is something that's got a levy that's been paid in all these years? That is another factor that you can put in as part of the rationale for why the regime has been exceptionally benign for the life insurers and pretty tough for everybody else.
Yeah,
I'll just flag we've gone 5 minutes over time. It's been a really great conversation. Thank you everyone. Thank you, Connor, and everyone else.
Chris, are there any last questions before we disappear?
Absolutely. I don't know if John wanted to come back on that quickly, but Bobby has one final question, I think.
Thank you. Quickly, I mean, super tax relates to super profits. So it means someone's losing out. The only people losing out here are the members, and so it seems bizarre. We're gonna support allow for every 50 billion that transitions to insure, that's 10 billion of value that can never go to members, but it should do. And so I think one of the comments talks about full indexation. That I mean, the members, there's a clear social injustice here, loss of value, hence super tax. But it's the member that loses. So full indexation, the buyout world would be.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things which it would be perfectly possible to do is to say, okay, you don't have to pay this super tax if you increase the benefits paid to your members by a similar amount. Yeah, but it comes out of the insurers no matter what. It's a windfall tax in one form or another.
Bobby,
right, Chris, I think you wanted to end this thing.
Yeah, I was going to make one quick point. Was even you put away the theory of this, you just have to look at the fact that there's insurance companies reopening to issue this business, and private equity's been all over it for a number of years, and that's even before the solvency got a bit easier for insurers. So it's clear as mud that it's really clear that they're making loads of money in this area.
Yes, when insurers go running to write a new line, when bodies like Royal London decide they're going to reopen, you have to understand that what you're getting is money for nothing. Yeah. So tax it. I actually wonder whether 3 billion is sufficient. Yeah. But yeah, there we are.
3 billion per annum.
No, it's 3 billion one off.
I know. I was. If you look at the super profit, it's 3 billion per annum.
Yeah, I mean, if you're writing 50 billion of this stuff a year, profit margins are 9 to 10%. That's 5 billion of profit. Yeah,
MPV, gross.
yeah. Yeah, what should you do? Maybe tax it at 25%, so 1.25 billion annually. One for HMT and the inland revenue.
I'm sure they could do with it.
Fantastic presentation today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Con. That was fantastic, and I'm reluctant to wrap up, but I'm aware we're 8 minutes past. So thank you everyone for your contributions, and yeah, thank you, Con. It was a really fascinating conversation, and learned a lot through it.
If anyone has any queries, they can email me anyway. They know that, or if there are any that you get, Chris, just send them my way.
Will do. Thank you, Con.
Okay.
So thanks everyone, and as ever, we'll sort of pray for peace in the East and peace in the Middle East, as important as ever, and hope things sort out there. I'm not currently sure what the next session is going to be next week, but I know Steve will be in touch, and Steve will be sending out the invites. Thank you all for your contributions and staying with us, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Take care. Thanks all.
Thanks, Em.